My name is John. This is a photo of me. You can see the resemblance. I'm on the Frontend Infrastructure team at a company called Coursera. It's an education company. There's lots of courses on there. We partner with a lot of universities. Check it out sometime. And on that team, I spend a lot of time thinking about how product developers work, think about their tools, their workflows, their processes, thinking about how do we take this JavaScript ecosystem and make sure that we are all productive in that system. And one of the things that we've hit a lot is this idea of fetching data. We have tons of microservices, tons of APIs, and we want to be able to access that in a straightforward way. And turns out this is a problem that other people have hit too. GraphQL is Facebook's solution to this. It's an open source specification, and it does a really great job of that. So if you take anything away from this, GraphQL is a way to stitch together tons and tons of data, no matter where it is. So today's talk, I'm going to be covering two main sections. One, I'm going to be talking about GraphQL, the language itself, the actual thing that you would be typing and running. And then I'm also going to be talking about the GraphQL runtime, the actual API that serves these requests. And as we may learn, this may not actually be a server either. So first of all, what is GraphQL? I talked a little bit about this before, but the QL in GraphQL stands for query language. And I'm going to give you the description that's straight from the website because it's really, really succinct and really straightforward. First is you describe your data. This is a really key part. We'll talk about this as well. But you describe your data. In this case, we're going to say there's a type. This type is a project. It has a name, a tagline, and contributors. And you can see exactly what those fields actually represent. You ask for what you want. This is what your product would ask for. It says, I'm going to make a query. I want the project with a name GraphQL, and I want the field name tagline on it. Now, you may say, oh, this looks really close to JSON, and that's actually really important. The return value from this is actually JSON, and it's going to look exactly like the query that you sent. And this is generally just like a really great API, and you know exactly what you're going to get back because that's what you asked for. So starting off, let's talk a little bit about the backing schemas. And these schemas are really, really powerful and enable a ton of functionality, especially in the JavaScript ecosystem. So first thing is, when you're creating a GraphQL schema, what you're doing here is you're describing everything that is possible in this API. Anything that could possibly be returned here. And this is great because when was the last time you used a REST API that was really well documented? Or when was, let's be serious. And of course, even if your APIs are great, you're going to use somebody else's API, and that API might not have any documentation. And even if it's documented, it may not be enforced. So having a schema in GraphQL ensures that the things that you see are going to be the things that you get. And so with these schemas, we can actually do validation. So when you're writing a query you're doing your JavaScript development, whatever you're doing, you can actually verify that yes, indeed, this will actually work against our production servers. And this means a lot less runtime errors because you know what data you're going to get and what type it is. So again, the GraphQL schema gives us the basis of everything that is possible when communicating from the server to the client, or in any case, just any API that you could think of that you can describe with the GraphQL schema. When you're actually accessing your server, your GraphQL server, you're going to be writing queries. And this is generally what you're going to be doing most of the time. You're going to be accessing data, reading data from a store, reading it from an API. And here's a really simple query. We saw this before. We have our project. We're asking for something, a project with the name GraphQL, and we're going to get the field name tagline on it. But just as easily, we could ask for another field, an author, and it returns a type string. And you can imagine any permutation of these things. You can add aliases. You can keep nesting. If there was more information about an author, maybe I could keep going and ask for more information about that author. Whatever it is, the thing that you ask for is the thing that you get back. We also have a construct called Fragments. And Fragments are really useful because they allow you to encapsulate little bits and pieces of your query. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's really nice. And just so people know here, this ... is the spread syntax here. And this allows us to spread fragments of a particular resource or a field or a type within that type and allows you to name what that little fragment is going to be. All right, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about using GraphQL in a typical React application. And for this example, I'm going to use something from Coursera. This is the course description page for one of our more interesting courses, machine learning. And we're going to break this down into its components. You might be familiar with this process. There's a banner at the top there. There's a course description component. There's a university information thing. There's an instructor thing component that's rendering a profile photo. And this is a very natural way to use React. And this is what a GraphQL query for a page like this might look like. And this is interesting because each of these different components actually resolves their data from different places. They're all different APIs. And whether or not that's actually a good choice, we have to live with this choice. And so, but with GraphQL, we can say in one big query, let's grab everything, all the data that we need from all the different places, let's put it all together. And you'll see here on the right, it's a little bit in small text there, but we're breaking down the actual query based on what components need what. And here's a better look at it. You can see the top level is the React component, each of the React components and the data they need. But if you think about it, a GraphQL query doesn't, you don't want to have this big hunkin' thing flying around all the place. Good thing we have fragments. And so with these fragments, we can actually encapsulate the little bits and pieces of data that every single component needs. And the component can say, these are the things I need. So the university can, we can delegate to the university component all the things that it needs. We can delegate to the instructor component all the things that it needs. And that's really great because now your GraphQL query looks kind of like a React application or a React component. And so it's very natural to use GraphQL in the ways that you would use React. So when we build React applications, we actually have every component declare its own data requirements. This is really great because as you swap in components, as you add new functionality, every bit of, just like the JSX that you have in there, it declares exactly what it's showing. And even if you have overlapping data, that doesn't really matter. But it's really bad when you delete a field from somewhere and something else was expecting it. It makes components a lot more self-sufficient to be able to say, I need this data, and I will render fine if I have this data. So GraphQL queries allow the client to declare exactly what it needs in the form that it needs it. Your mobile clients can say, I need 10 fields. Your web client can say, I need 8 fields. And they can all use the same API. They don't need a special mobile API or a special REST API for each client. That's really powerful. Speaking of clients, I'm actually going to be talking about a few runtimes and libraries that help make using GraphQL a lot simpler and allow you to actually take advantage of a lot of the things that I've been talking about. You may have heard of a couple of these. We mentioned this earlier. I think Ben mentioned this. There's one from Facebook called Relay. There's one from Meteor Development Group called Apollo. They each have their different approaches and their different opinions about how to deal with caching GraphQL. And there's other runtimes as well. But ultimately, it allows you to take advantage of the typedness of your GraphQL queries and allow you to make really, really interesting usages of GraphQL. The one most important thing that I think is important here is caching. So these clients, Apollo in particular, provide really advanced caching for your GraphQL queries. And what I mean is, you've had this same pattern in a lot of applications where you have a list of things. In this case, let's take a list of books. And when you click on one of those books, you go to a detailed page, and that page has the same information that you just came from. Now with caching, we can actually, because all of these are types, we have all books here, we know it's going to return a list of books. We know the field name is going to be on the book. And on the right side, we know that we're going to get a book by ID. If we have the book and we have their ID and we have the name and we're asking for a book by its ID, there's actually no need to go to the server again. We already retrieved it. Let's just use it where it is. And so clients allow you to take advantage of the fact that we know exactly the things that are coming back from our servers and allow you to cache them in your web applications. So clients make adopting GraphQL in your application a breeze. They're really easy to set up, and they provide a ton of the functionality that you need to make sure that you're making the right queries and that things work as expected. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the server because this is an important part of the equation when you're using GraphQL. I've provided you a lot of information about GraphQL, the language, and a lot of the magic that's there and how powerful just using the language can be. But it's important to understand how the server actually works too, because the server is where a lot of the power comes from. And in GraphQL servers, what's happening here is that we're taking that schema that we use to define all the things that are possible, all the pieces of data, and we're actually doing the work of stitching it all together. Every field that you see in a GraphQL query can be resolved to a different function. And in GraphQL, they're normally called resolvers. Now, this is a little different from your REST API. REST API, you may call one API and it returns you a bunch of stuff. And it's a little hard to say, OK, one of these fields goes somewhere else. But what if you need to create a website where you have a page, you have some information about a course, you have some information about a professor, you need to get their Facebook information. Maybe from their Facebook, you need to keep going and get some of their tweets. I don't know why you do that, but think about the kind of data that you use and that you use to create like a complex application, and you realize you're doing all that already. You're just doing it implicitly, and you're doing it on the front end. So by mapping all of these resolvers on the server, you can actually deal with all that glue, joining all that data from all of these disparate sources, and you can push it to the back end. And this is really great. So in this example here, when you're querying for a book, you can go get your list of books from one API. When it comes back, you can actually resolve the information about the author from another API. And maybe the title is a work in progress. You can actually just hard code that in there. But from a client perspective, from a product perspective, nothing has changed. You're still using a book and its title and its author the way that you expect it to. Who really cares where it comes from? So what this means is you have a single endpoint from data from anywhere. You have this list of books. We don't care where it comes from. We have a title and an author from those things too. Again, we don't care where it comes from. If you're building a product, ultimately, that stuff is going to get resolved by an API anyway. So GraphQL servers are really, really flexible. There's two major ways of using them and developing them. One is as a proxy to existing data. As I mentioned, at Coursera, we have a ton of existing REST APIs. None of our backend developers have to do anything specific to serve GraphQL. We actually auto-generate all of our GraphQL from our existing REST APIs. So all the logic that has to do with storing information about courses, about students, all that gets handled by an existing API already. But what is nice is that now a product developer gets the API that they need, only the fields they need. You could also put the data in there and actually have it be the business logic layer itself. Your GraphQL layer could make REST calls on your behalf or database calls on your behalf. There are libraries like Prisma, which I think Johannes will be talking about tomorrow, that solve those kinds of problems. I'm going to talk a little bit about tools because that's kind of my job and I like talking about it. I think it's important here because you have so much information now about your APIs that now you can actually use tools to your benefit that you might not have had when you're using a REST API. For example, here's something called Graphical, and I'll tell you, this is the killer app for GraphQL. And what it does is that it exposes your GraphQL API in an editor, and this is in a browser, and allows you to access every single piece of data on any API that you expose in one place. Just being able to explore all of the things, grab all of that information, and do all of that within the length of this GIF is incredible. And this thing really has changed how we discover all of the APIs that we have. The second is something like ESLint. Because you're declaring all of your data and you're not just hitting an endpoint and expecting that the JSON that comes back is nice, we can actually tell you, hey, you're asking for a field that doesn't exist. Or you're asking for a field in the wrong place, or maybe you're missing something. You can lint against all those kinds of things. And make sure that when you're sending out code to production that you're actually sending out valid APIs, valid API calls. And with that type information, you can actually keep going and you can infer other type information. So using something like Apollo CodeGen, you can take your GraphQL schema and map that to Flow or TypeScript. And so in your JavaScript, in your React application, you can use your API data the way that it was intended to be used. If it's a string on the back end, it will continue to be a string through your API, and then it will be a string in JavaScript, and your compiler will tell you if you're using your API incorrectly. That's huge. There's so many times that I've used a number as a string from an API because I didn't know that it was supposed to be a number. So GraphQL enables a huge ecosystem of tools to make developers a lot more effective. I'll tell you personally, I find everything that I do when I'm building products, I want to put GraphQL on top of it. And what's nice about GraphQL is that you can just slap it on anything. You don't even need to have the API on the back end. So in summary, GraphQL makes it really simple to query lots of data no matter where it is. It could be on the client, it could be on the server. Wherever your data is, GraphQL can handle it. Just like React, GraphQL is really easily decomposable and I think is a very good match for React. And if you're interested in getting started, I think the base resources are really incredible. The people behind these websites have done a great job of explaining GraphQL and talking about its power. GraphQL.org is the one from Facebook, I think is really awesome. GraphQL.com is from the folks at Apollo and Meteor. And launchpad.graphql.com/new will get you a GraphQL server running in your browser right now. But wait till the end because there's other talks. And that's all I have. Thank you.